My name is Joe Peroni. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am also a clinical supervisor, which means that I have a lot of experience evaluating other mental health clinicians. In addition, I've also been a personal trainer for about 35 years, and I've been a bodybuilding champion since about 1982. Today, we're going to try to assess Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is a clinical psychologist. We're going to assess one of his videos. It's about 6 minutes long, but this is going to be quite the workout because he says a lot of things. He jumps around a lot, and I'm going to be looking to check out who he's citing, and I want to see what type of evidence he's using to come up with the answers that he has. So really what I'm looking to do today, I want to see if Jordan Peterson is going to do an honest, robust inquiry into the academic information. And I want to see if he's going to take the stance of being ideological, maybe an activist, and being politically motivated. So these are some of the things I'm going to be looking for as we go through the video. The first question, right off the top, he's going to be asked about emojis. And again, he's going to be moving from emojis. He's going to mention Joe Rogan, the LGBTQ community. He's going to talk about Bill C-16, contagions, the daycare scare of the 80s, Henry Ellenberger, hysteria, Abigail Schreier, who wrote the book Irreversible Damage, and Lisa Littman, who coined the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria. And then he's going to move into expressing thoughts about gender fluidity and transgender well-being. So there's a lot of material to cover here, and I'll try to do it as quick as possible, but this is going to be a little bit difficult. So I'm sorry for that right off the bat. So let's go.
What color skin emoji do you use?
If I used one, it would be black.
Why?
Why not?
I'm going to answer that question right off the bat. Now, the question about what color emoji, it seems kind of frivolous, and it seems rather insignificant. And I can agree with that. But I'm taking this from the standpoint of a mental health clinician here, because I am one and he's one. So let's do this. Let's assess. Some of the best tools that a therapist can have is to be empathetic, compassionate, be non-judgmental. And if you really can't understand somebody else's point of view, that's okay too, because we can't understand everything and we don't always have to agree with things. But if you can't help somebody, then you should at least do no harm. And what I'm seeing here is like an annoyance. Like this question really bothered him. Like he just doesn't want to deal with this issue of race. And I can kind of get that on the one side. However, I'm a human being too, and whenever I've had let's say a text from a black person, and they want to send an emoji, if that's their thing to do, it's gonna be of a black emoji, right? It makes sense. And if I'm talking to a Hispanic person and they want to send a brown colored thumbs up or a smiley face, I can understand that because that's how they identify. Why wouldn't they? That totally makes sense. Now, because I'm considered to be white, it doesn't mean that I'm in the majority, so I just can't understand somebody else using a black emoji. Like he seems to have no ability to understand anybody else's point of view. And if you don't know, because you can't see the video, but Jordan Peterson is an older, white, heterosexual man. And he just seems so off-put by this that there's no way I think his mind is open to the fact of a person of color would use a color type of emoji. It seems so insignificant, so why does it bother him so much? Let's continue.
It's so preposterous, all of that. You know, everything that's happened to Rogan, all the...
Everything that's happened to Joe Rogan, and he's shaking his head like, oh my God, he's going through so much stuff. Let's talk about Joe Rogan. What's happening to him? Here you have a guy that I'm sure is a good enough guy. I don't have any problem with him. Listen, he's got a gym membership. He works out like I do, and he does UFC stuff. He's probably a lot better at the UFC fighting than I am. He did Fear Factor. He was I guess you call him a sportscaster for UFC. Good for him. It's interesting though that there was a show about 15 years ago called Idiocracy where the UFC guy gets to be the president of the United States. And here we're looking at a guy that is of average intelligence, let's say, that's basically a UFC guy. And he's become the number one thought leader in the world. He has so much pull and so much influence. And good for him. That's great. But the question I think becomes, what type of responsibility do you have when you have that much influence? Because I know he does a lot of different shows, but the ones that I would want to talk about to ask the question, not tell anybody what to do, but just asking. When you put people on your show, you shine a light on them, you put them on a pedestal, you give them this grand stage, and you say, go. And they start talking, and they're spreading vaccine lies. They're conspiracy theorists. They're climate change deniers. They put out misinformation and hate towards the LGBTQ community. What's your responsibility here? Because if you had the intelligence to question these people correctly, or the wherewithal to do it, these people would get knocked off their high horse in a second. But he doesn't do that. He just sits back and lets these people pontificate. And so they become more and more and more powerful to the point where you can literally say that by giving these people a platform, he is willfully hurting and killing probably thousands of people. That's just the reality of it. Now, is it a free speech issue? I think that's a good question. I think we're all entitled to free speech. I believe in it. The problem is, though, when you're working off of somebody else's platform, you have to worry about terms of service. And the people who are running that particular platform, no matter what it may be, you could be a publishing company, I don't care what you are. But if you want to endorse certain language and certain people that are willfully going out of their way to confuse and muddy the waters about truth for alternative facts, this is a modern day yellow day journalism in a sense. If you want to endorse that and you're hurting and killing people, is there a responsibility to that? That would be the question. The question I have for Jordan Peterson is he's so one way pro Joe Rogan without the thought of what's the other side? Are there a lot of people who are hurt by this misinformation? Is it okay just to lie and just to tell people figure it out on your own? I don't know. It's a good question. At least I believe it is. Let's continue.
This idiocy around race, this insistence that we can be reduced to our race, our ethnicity, our sexual identity. It's so appalling and it's so destructive.
Okay, so we had another little twist and turn there, so I have to stop it. He said this idiocy surrounding race. Then he said the insistence that we can be reduced to our race, ethnicity, sexual identity is appalling and destructive. I don't know anybody who would disagree with that. I'm in 100% agreement. Nobody wants to be reduced to those things. That's true. But, however, again, we need to look at the other side. We need to question him because the person who's giving him these questions, or that one question, just letting him talk. Again, as an older, white, heterosexual man, he's seeming like the victim here, like he's the one who's being reduced to his race and his ethnicity. And it's like, oh, what a hassle for him. And listen, it's a hassle for anybody. But let's look at the other side. Do you think indigenous people or our Native Americans who are absolutely annihilated, the whole race was basically wiped off the face of the planet? Do you think they didn't want to be reduced to their ethnicity? Of course. How about black people that were brought here against their will? And they were brought here as slaves to build this country. Do you think maybe they didn't want to be reduced to their race and nationality? Of course, but he's not talking about that. He's talking about himself. What about gay and lesbian people who their suicide rates are extremely high, much higher than the average person? Why? It's because they get treated horribly. They're not I mean, things are getting better, that's true, but not because of people like him. It's because of people who are trying to say that these people deserve to be treated like everybody else because they shouldn't be reduced to only their sexual identity. So there's people right now that are committing suicide because they are being reduced to their sexual identity. And he's not mentioning that. He's flying the flag for his heterosexual white male self, and he doesn't see the other side at all. It's just amazing to me. He's been very adamant about being this anti-social justice person. And that's okay. Pick your side, or maybe somewhere in the middle. That doesn't matter. But again, to play devil's advocate, you have to ask, like, throughout history, who have been social justice people, or social, like he would say, who have been the social justice warriors? And you would have to say it would be people like Jesus, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Gandhi. So if you're on the opposite side of people like that, you have to see, like, ask yourself the question, do you really think that you are on the right side of history at that point? Let's continue.
And one of the reasons that I had a lot of reasons for making my political stance in relationship to Canada's compelled speech laws. I had a lot of reasons for making my views about that known. One of them was the fact that my government had introduced a bill that required me to say things a certain way, which was an unparalleled move in the history of Western democracies and something the Americans had made strictly unconstitutional, I believe, in 1942. So that was part of it. Part of it was I knew that this top-down mandated belief that confusion around gender identity was a positive occurrence to provide that freedom. Let's say I knew that for every
Let me keep going here.
person that saved, that would doom 1,000 people.
Okay, let me stop it there. He's talking about this confusion about gender identity, that if he kind of believed in that, he could save one person but doom 1,000. Make sure you remember that number, because that's not the first time he's going to say that. He's going to continue to say that in talking about this and being open about it and being aware of it, that it will doom 1,000 people and it'll only save one. So it's not a good thing to do, to talk about gender fluidity. Let's go back a little bit. He does move around a lot. So again, I told you this is going to be difficult. He mentions Bill C-16. Let's be honest about this bill. If it wasn't for his opposition to Bill C-16, Jordan Peterson would just be your average college professor, and he would be your average clinical psychologist. Nothing wrong with that. I'm in the same field he is, and I know a lot of psychologists and a lot of therapists, and they are extremely important. They do great work. I wouldn't be in this field if I didn't think it was important. But he has jumped to a different level, not because of his psychology, but because of this type of bill that made him somehow much more famous and much more powerful. Let's be honest. Again, one more time. He's a clinical psychologist. He is not a lawyer. There's a level of narcissism here. Not ready to say he has a personality disorder. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. But it is narcissistic to be holding to the same thing now for like 4 years or maybe longer when he's not a lawyer. Again, repeat, he is not a lawyer. So what we want to do here is look at what do lawyers think. Well, there's no lawyer that actually agrees with his interpretation. So everything he says here is basically a lie, and he got famous for no reason. That's the answer. And he continues to lie about compelled and required speech. Nobody's telling him to say anything, and no one's going to arrest him for saying a different word. Now, he was quoted as saying that if he had a student in one of his classes that wanted him to use a certain pronoun, he would not do it. Well, okay, but we're going back to the original part. As a therapist, if you don't have any empathy and compassion, and you can't see the world through somebody else's eyes, and you are an extremely judgmental human being, where is this great therapist we're seeing? He's actually very harmful to that. And again, what he's worried about, I don't know, because, the answer is no people have ever been arrested for not using somebody's preferred pronoun. Now, you can be a jerk, you can be inconsiderate, but it's not illegal to do that. So again, he can be a jerk all he wants. He's not going to jail for it. And why he's still talking about this, I don't know. So what's the major problem that he has? Again, it's not a psychology position. He's not talking about processing people's trauma. He's actually making people's traumas worse, a lot worse. Let's move on.
Primarily girls, to a kind of psychological contagion as confusion about sex and gender identity ramped up. I knew the literature on psychological contagion. It's quite.
What is that? What's psychological contagion?
I'm going to answer this first because, again, I don't want to be too picky, but it's not called psychological contagion. So I'm going to correct the doctor here. It's more typically known as social or emotional contagion. And the definition would be is to influence people's emotions and behaviors. That's basically what it is. You can look at it as in a fad will do that. I live in Las Vegas. It's hot here most of the time. But somehow in the 90s, everybody thought it was cool to wear flannel here. Like, how could you sell that to people? That was a social and emotional contagion. Everyone wanted to feel like they were, part of the Seattle scene or something like that, right? So there's a lot of contagions. He's going to say that there's really only one. There's not. He's going to talk about the satanic panic, which was the daycare in the 80s. Before he gets in here and he starts saying he's so worried about the girls, understand this. The satanic panic of the 80s that he's taught, the daycare, was because of conservatives who didn't want daycares to exist. How come they didn't want them to exist? Because they didn't want women to work. They wanted women to stay home. They wanted them to cook, to clean, to have babies, and just wait there for the husbands to come home. Again, listen, if you're into that, that's cool. Nothing wrong with that. But what is wrong is to say that the people who worked in the daycare centers were all Satanists. And who would want to send their kids to a bunch of satanic women, right? So they put out that scare and it just destroyed a lot of daycare centers at that time. And now he's kind of falling back, eating his own tail, because now he's going to say it was a bad thing, yet conservatives are the one who pushed all of it. So let's move on.
You could think about them as psychological epidemics. So the last one of any real size was the satanic daycare scares in the 1980s. Well, you're probably not old enough to remember that, but the longest sentences in U.S. criminal justice history were handed out often to women who were accused of late onset female sexual predation of children in daycare centers. The FBI invented a whole new category of perpetrator, a category that didn't exist, because there are no late onset female child sexual predators. They don't exist. But there were
nothing wrong with him saying this.
Obtained prison sentences of several hundred years for
That's
hypothetically being involved in these satanic daycare abuse rituals. And there was just swept across the whole country, like the Salem witch trials, except at a much larger scale. There's a book called Satan's Silence that was written by a lawyer and a social worker that documents it. It's just unbelievable. There were stories about underground tunnels where children were being taken down and every possible thing you could think of was happening to them, all in the name of satanic ritual.
It's true.
It was a contagion.
That's true.
And those things happen. It happened with cutting behavior.
Let me stop him there before he starts drifting. This whole thing where he seems to be so perplexed about that it actually happened, it's still happening today. When we look at this, there's groups like QAnon that are still doing a satanic panic where they're talking about how liberals steal kids, right? And they're all a bunch of pedophiles and they drink their blood. Like, just saying that makes me sound ridiculous. And if you didn't know about that, you would think I'm ridiculous. Except the fact that QAnon is a massive thing. You see them all over. They're a big part of the conservative or Republican parties these days. So this satanic panic never stopped. It's still going on. Even back in the day, it was the PMRC, where they thought that heavy metal music was satanic and they wanted to put labels on everything. They've never gone away. They keep pushing this, and there's a lot of contagions. Let me just go through a few here. You've got, again, he is one himself, with the amount of people that he has following him that don't question anything he says. The rise of white supremacy in the United States these days, which was deemed the number one domestic terrorist threat in the United States right now, is the rise of white supremacy. That is obviously a contagion. MGTOW, men going their own way. Again, agree or disagree, don't care, it doesn't matter to me. But when you have a bunch of men that are socially and emotionally just completely changing, and we've never seen men like this before, that's a contagion. There's a lot of books right now being put up to be banned. A lot of them about the United States history, and a lot of them that have anything to do with racism. They don't want them in schools anymore. They want them banned. That's also contagion, because how in the world is that okay for people to do? But somehow it's gaining steam and momentum that that's the good thing to do, to start censoring people. There's a whole bunch. I mean, if you want to get into ridiculous stuff, like when I was a kid, there was this gum called Bubble Yum, and somebody said that they were made out of spiders' eggs. That basically destroyed that company because people actually believed that. That's also a contagion. Now he's comparing these contagions with the satanic panic, and he's comparing it to people with gender dysphoria, which I think is a really hard thing to connect, but he's trying to do it. But let's see where else he goes here.
Behaviors happen with eating disorders. This is almost all among girls, because teenage girls are most prone to this. They called it hysteria back in Freud's time, but there's a book by a man named Henry Ellenberger called Discovery of the Unconscious that traces back psychogenic epidemics to about 300 years. And I knew that.
Not to get too picky with him, but Henry Ellenberger's book, his interpretation is a very misguided interpretation of that book. So it seems to be that he's trying to take something and bend it to his will, because that book is not really defending his point, even though he's saying it. But he knows he can say it because nobody knows who that author is, and no one knows who that book is. But some people do.
You know, people in adolescence, especially people of a certain personality configuration, have some trouble settling into a stable identity. And for a variety of reasons, it can be high negative emotion, which is associated with low self-esteem.
Okay, let me just say this real quick. Some people have trouble finding their identity in life just because that's the way it is. Like he said, like part of it, it's true. But one of the main reasons that he's not going to talk about it is because of our society is so unaccepting of people who are different. That's why. That's why a gay person has a lot of trouble in our society admitting to themselves that they're gay, or if they have some type of gender fluidity. If there was an open, honest, loving, compassionate, caring society, they wouldn't have as many problems. It's the fact that they're told that they're wrong and something's wrong with them, and they get disowned by their families, that's the number one cause of the problem. And he's going to say that somehow doctors and therapists have created all of these categories of genders, and it's confusing the kids. That's not the way it works. When adolescents are growing up, they face their issues and their problems. When doctors and therapists see this in people, they start to categorize it. So the doctors and therapists are learning from their clients. It's not the other way. Doctors and therapists don't tell clients what to do with their bodies and how to feel about their gender. It's the opposite way. So again, he has this incredibly wrong. So many things here he says are just so messed up. Let's go back to this other thing when he was talking about contagions, about eating disorders and cutting. He is correct here. Those are contagions as well. But he's missing the point, because those are the symptoms. It's not the cause. Yes, a lot of times if a person is in a lot of pain, especially girls, if they're in pain and they cut to make themselves feel a little bit better temporarily, to take away their emotional pain, a bunch of girls don't get together who are happy and they enjoy their life and go, hey, let's cut each other. Well, I'll cut myself, you cut you. They're not doing that. It's people that have a lot of emotional pain that do this. When he's talking about eating disorders, again, he's very much against talking about socially constructed personalities and thoughts and that way people do things. He's all about the biology. The thing is about eating disorders, a lot of it comes from the community because the community has standards. You need to be this, you need to be this height, you need to be this weight, you need to look like this. And this is what causes a lot of eating disorders for people, but he's not mentioning that as well. He's just saying it's automatically a contagion because if somebody's thin, I have to be thin too. It makes no sense. The real cause of this, most of the time, and if you were a good therapist, and if he was a good therapist, he would either know it or say it. So I don't know if he's just going along his ideological trail or if he's being intellectually dishonest. I'm not sure. But when we see eating disorders and we see cutting, what you really have to look for is sexual abuse or extreme trauma. Or sometimes it's obviously both because sexual abuse is extreme trauma. That's typically the cause. The cause isn't hanging out with your friends and figuring out that somebody else cut them, so I'm going to cut myself too. It's not the cause. The fact that he very rarely talks about trauma is almost perverse, considering the fact that he's a mental health clinician. Let's move on.
Those are more or less the same thing. And then, in all likelihood, high trait openness, which is the creativity dimension. And the high trait openness people, they're the ones that are more likely to have green hair and red hair and lots of piercings and lots of tattoos and dread.
Some of that I agree with, right? Because you have openness to experience. You're going to be a little bit more open about your, hair color and all that. You can be more artistic. But again, he has this wrong. He said people with low self-esteem generally have negative emotion. That's true. No doubt about it. But he's missing the major point here is that people with neuroticism, or again, you could say it this way, people that have a lot of high negative feelings, such as anger, frustration, anxiety, these people don't necessarily have low self-esteem. A lot of times when you have bad feelings about things, you are very emotionally in tune. You have a lot of emotional intelligence. Like Jiddu Krishnamurti say, if you say you're healthy in a profoundly sick society, you're not healthy. So if you see the world as it is, you can have a very high self-esteem, but you don't feel very good. We call it existential anxiety. If you drive down the street and you see homeless people, you can have a high self-esteem and still have negative feeling about society. So again, he is categorically just flat out wrong. And I can't tell, again, is if he's just taking this thread and trying to make it work for him, but he just doesn't see anything outside his own little small view. Let's continue.
In a somewhat, in a non-standard manner, let's say, that's all associated with creative behavior. And they have trouble catalyzing a single identity. And then if you throw in categorical confusion, which is exactly what you're doing when you declare that there's, an endless number of gender identities.
We talked about this. Doctors are not throwing that out. It's the people themselves who feel it, that feel good enough to talk about it finally.
Contagion. You're going to demolish them.
There is an
Abigail Schreier has documented that quite nicely in her book, Irreversible Damage. And it's way more girls than boys. And
we're going to talk about Abigail Schreier in a second. I want to wait for him to get finished, and then I'm going to hit you with the actual information. It's very important who you go to bed with. And he's going to bed here with Abigail Schreier, who wrote the book Irreversible Damage. And he's going to talk about wanting to see the data, but he doesn't mention any. And if he did see the data, why are you citing Abigail Schreier's book? You know why? Because there's one piece of data in it, and that's from Lisa Littman. But I'm going to get to that in a second.
It's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So you think, well, perhaps a few people who are transgender benefited from this new reality. But for everyone who's benefited, and I'd like to see data just showing how much they actually benefited. But that'll take a long time to accrue.
You'd like to see the data? I got the data for you, man. Why you don't know the data? You're acting like it doesn't exist. Don't worry, we'll get to it.
There's 1,000 people who've been just demolished by this.
1,000 people demolished for being cared about and accepted for who they are, and for being allowed to talk about their anxiety, about their gender fluidity. Makes no sense, but continue.
So, and then what else on the, well, that's basically that on the political front. I could see all that coming. I talked to the Canadian Senate about it when they put in the legislation. They didn't listen. They just thought racism, bigotry, sexism. It's like, yeah, have it your way. But, you know, so what, all these girls that have rapid onset gender dysphoria and disfiguring themselves and taking hormones and, you know, wreaking havoc with themselves and their families and the broader culture.
Let's talk about that for a second. I need more time. We're going to talk about this rapid onset gender dysphoria that he mentions. That was coined by Lisa Littman again. But this part is really interesting right here. He said they wreak havoc. Well, first, okay, I don't want to be too, it's havoc, but okay, he wants to add a little twist to it. Okay, I'm fine. But he says people who basically come out, or people who are trying to really know their identity, they're wreaking havoc on their families. Hold it, what? Think about that. So when a person who is gay or lesbian or bisexual comes out, he's worried about them wreaking havoc on their families. Are you a therapist, man? Seriously? Like, I hope you don't have clients that are gay, that are worried about their family still loving them, or just disowning them because of their sexual identity that you said that they don't want to be reduced to. You're reducing them right now. Come on, man. Seriously? You're worried about people's parents being hurt because their child is gay. You're worried about the parents. You're not worried about the children. That's just amazing. Let's keep going.
These people that were so woke and so permissive, you think they're going to have that on their conscience? They're onto something. Some other noble venture.
What's happening, people?
All right, let me stop you there. He mentions there's some other noble venture, and he mentions like racism, bigotry, and sexism. I hate to tell you, but racism, bigotry, and sexism, there are noble ventures to make things a little bit fairer and equal for people, and that people are not treated like garbage, and they aren't reduced to their nationality, to their race, and their sexual identity. So listen, he's the one who said it, and so I'm going to do it for him. And if there's any Jordan Peterson fans out there, I'm sorry about this, but we're going to have to do it. We got to see the truth as it is. I told you, I wanted to see if Jordan Peterson would do a robust and honest look at the academic material and not be an ideologue. Well, you got what you got. So let's answer and ask the question, then we'll answer it. So what does the scholarly research say about the effect of gender transition on transgender well-being? Here's your overview. We conducted, this is from Cornell University, by the way, one of the best schools in the world. We conducted a systematic literature review of all peer-reviewed articles published in English between 1991 and 2017 that assessed the effect of gender transition on transgender well-being. He seems to care about it. He says that you can only save one and you're going to demolish 1,000 others. Let's see if it's true. Why didn't this reporter or whoever is talking to him question him? Because he doesn't know any better. All right, transgender well-being. We identified 56 studies that consist of primary research on the subject, of which 52 or 93% found that gender transition improved the overall well-being of transgender people, while 4, which is only 7%, report mixed or null findings. We found no studies concluding that gender transition causes overall harm. Hey, Jordan, the thousands that you said you're demolishing, let me read this again. No studies concluding that gender transition causes overall harm. As an added resource, we separately include 17 additional studies that consist of literature reviews and practitioner guidelines. Here's the bottom line. This search found a robust international consensus in the peer-reviewed literature that gender transition, including medical treatments such as hormone therapy and surgeries, improves the overall well-being of transgender individuals. The literature also indicates that greater availability of medical and social support for gender transition contributes to a better quality of life for those who identify as transgender. Hey, Jordan, nothing you said had any validity to it in those 6 minutes. Sorry. Here's some more research findings. The scholarly literature makes clear that gender transition is effective in treating gender dysphoria and can significantly improve the well-being of transgender individuals. Among the positive outcomes of gender transition and related medical treatments for transgender individuals are improved quality of life, greater relationship satisfaction, higher self-esteem and confidence, and reductions in anxiety, depression, suicidality, and substance abuse. The positive impact of gender transition on transgender well-being has grown considerably in recent years as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Listen, and there's a whole thing more. I'm not going to go through it because this is going to be too long. But again, Jordan, it's good to know who you go to bed with. And you mentioned Abigail Schreier. She says things nicely, I think, as you said. She wrote the book Irreversible Damage. Let's talk about the premise of this supposedly scholarly work. The premise of this book, number one, she says there's a massive number of people who identify as transgender, but they are just confused. Number two, they are busy being rushed into gender-affirming medical interventions and surgeries that they will later regret. That's the premise of the book. Does that sound scholarly to you? There's one professional group who shares her view and Jordan Peterson's view. The name of this group is called the American College of Pediatricians. The ACLU has deemed this a hate group. They only have 500 members in this group, and they name themselves accordingly to sound like this other group. This other group is called the American Academy of Pediatrics, who has 67,000 members. Here's a review of the book. Abigail Schreier did not interview transgender youth. She interviewed their parents. God, he's citing this as real academic literature? Sorry. The book was published by Regnery Publishing, whose stated mission is to publish and advance conservative viewpoints. Sound neutral to you? Does that sound like an academic paper to you? It's not. She says 70% of gender dysphoria cases resolve on its own. Unfortunately for her, that's false. There's no evidence that states that. All the evidence states otherwise. Continuing, she says that kids say that they are transgender because it's less stigmatizing to come out as a lesbian, gay, or bisexual than it is to say you're transgender. Once again, that has been tested for validity. That is absolutely false. And number 5 on our list, Abigail Schreier has ignored all of the gender-affirming literature. And she used her own opinion, which is amazing because the fact that Jordan Peterson would cite that is insane. Let's continue. He does mention in his talk, Jordan Peterson mentions rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was coined by somebody named Lisa Littman. And she put out one paper on that. That's the one that Jordan is citing. One. When you've got 72 peer-reviewed articles here? Okay. Here's some things about rapid onset gender dysphoria. Number 1. It is not recognized by any major professional association as a valid mental health diagnosis. Number 2, its use has been discouraged by every major medical profession group due to lack of reputable scientific evidence. Number 3, Lisa Littman did one study in 2018 that was not peer-reviewed and was criticized for its methodology and validity. But it ended up in Abigail Schreier's book, so Jordan Peterson can cite it, and then everybody could say he's a genius. In 2021, the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association co-signed a statement with 120 medical organizations calling for rapid onset gender dysphoria not to be used due to lack of any reputable scientific evidence. Show me the data, Jordan. You don't have it. It's all on the other side. Sorry. Now, how did Lisa Littman get her information? Check this out. She recruited parents who were already on one of 3 different anti-transgender websites. You think that's a neutral group of people? Come on now. And how good were these parents? Let's take a look. 75% of these parents had already rejected their children's identity and disowned them. That's where you're getting your information from? I don't want to hear it again, how this guy is Mr. Intellectual. He's smart, yes, but he's incredibly intellectually dishonest. And in no way did he do any looking through the actual material at all. None. As a matter of fact, he had a thought in his head and he bent every single thing he said to his will, and people just eat it up and listen to it. I hope that was valid for you today. If you like Jordan Peterson, I'm sorry about that, but hopefully what I did today at the very least is give you a template on how to look at people's work, to really study and assess what they're doing. And just because they cite a name or a book, you're allowed to look up who they are. And it's not character assassination. You do want to know where somebody's thoughts are coming from. You want to know who they're going to bed with and who they agree with. And again, I hate to say this, but you need to look up Mankind Quarterly, which is a white supremacy publication that came out about 80 years ago. And if you look through that, you will notice that Jordan Peterson, not all of his views, but most of his views are in lockstep with Mankind Quarterly, which again is pushing white supremacy pseudoscience. And they've been doing it for a really, really long time, about 80 years. Some of the things Jordan Peterson talks about is okay. When he talks about the big 5 personality traits, how he uses it sometimes is a little iffy. But I think I've said enough today. This is a long show. If you got through it all, that's great. I hope you enjoyed this. My name is Joe Peroni. If you would like to subscribe, that would be awesome. Thank you very much. Have a good night.